For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. I am your host Jade Black, and today I am continuing with my writing in different genres and formats series, and I'm talking about writing sci-fi. And, well, this is another genre like fantasy that I've openly had a bit of a love-hate relationship with, so strap on in. Because this is a bit more of a craft-based episode, I feel the need to say that, as always, this is not a podcast dedicated to writing advice. This is about me talking about my craft, my process, what works for me, that's the deal, all that jazz. There are elements of sci-fi that I love, so there's a lot of freedom in sci-fi, like in fantasy. It's a very free genre, and you get to explore places that you just genuinely would not otherwise go. You get to go into outer space, and I mean, some of that shit is really pretty cool. And you get to have lots of fun thinking about the ships and what would be on the ship and all of those sorts of things. Now, why I hate sci-fi is a lot of the same reasons as fantasy that you often end up with pages and pages of description, all that. I'll get onto that later. And pacing is often difficult. But a lot of sci-fi has a lot of very complex science in it that, I mean, I haven't done a degree in science. I don't know what you're talking about, and to be honest, I don't really care. But the other thing I really don't like with sci-fi, and this is a very particular criticism, is that there's always just a solution for everything. And this is one of the things in Star Trek in particular that really gets my goat is the universal translator. Because language barriers are really fun to play with, for starters. But also, if you just come across this, new species you've never come across before, or that people have had limited contact with, yeah, I'm not buying that your universal translator works. Thanks. Not having that. So why it's good to try sci-fi, and this is, again, the commercialist point, that sci-fi actually seems to get adapted a fair bit. It's a bit of a cult sci-fi, it's a bit of a cult adaptation thing, but it seems to happen a fair bit. This might be more of a trend at the moment, I don't know, but it seems to be a thing, be that adapted into books, or I mean, there are a lot of sci-fi video games out there, so it's definitely a decent sector to move in. So in terms of sci-fi, I've dabbled in it in shorts a fair bit. I did have a sci-fi project at one point that I've decided I'm not really interested in anymore, that I'd never had a name for besides the main character's name, which is Alexis, and this was sci-fi adventure, I guess. It was a lot about exploring different parts of space, bits that people hadn't been to very much. It was, elsewhere, for what it's worth. But, it was quite grim as well. And it just felt a bit too cookie cutter, I guess, for me to want to be interested in it, and also adventure is hard. Writing adventure is a genre that I might cover in time, just putting it out there. So common elements of sci-fi, I mean, travel is definitely one of the big ones, because, you got an entire galaxy, or potentially more than that, in front of you. It'd be a shame not to see it as much as anything, and I don't know, it's just kind of the thing in sci-fi that people travel through space, and yes, that's not every sci-fi, but it is a lot of sci-fi. There's a lot of travel involved, and I genuinely think that travel is one of the most difficult things to write. Sci-fi is a really difficult genre because of this alone, let alone everything else that goes with it. Betrayal is another really common element in sci-fi, and every episode this comes, I mean, betrayal is a thing in probably every genre of fiction at this point. And anytime it's a major element, you'll hear it in every single episode that it's generally something I'm not here for because it's very rarely done well and it just gets my fucking goat. And not in a good way because I really like goats, but you know, whatever. That is besides the point. A lot of the betrayal in sci-fi in particular feels very shallow. I mean, a lot of sci-fi is very plot driven as well, and that's never going to be my go-to cup of tea. Oh yes, plot driven, I'm always going to be a bit more skeptical of picking that up. So, the other thing in sci-fi that seems to come up literally every time is mass destruction. Like fantasy, sci-fi generally seems to default to being a high-stakes genre. There is a movement for cozy fantasy at the moment. I'm not convinced cozy sci-fi is a thing. It would be quite interesting to see somebody play with that, though. Mass destruction is a big thing, be that nukes or EMPs or meteors or black holes, I don't know. But mass destruction is a thing, and maybe that's your cup of tea, but it's generally speaking not mine. The other thing that comes up across most sci-fi is the small ragtag of rebels, or you and me versus the world thing. And while that is often a very cool element in a lot of fiction, with sci-fi I think it's harder to sell, because if you're talking about, I mean, the classic humans have dominated hundreds of planets across the galaxy, then you're looking at populations of billions, if not trillions, of people. Imagining a ragtag group of 4 to 10 people making a legitimate, massive change in a world like that, I think is very, very hard to sell. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be done well, and it has been. And I think it's one of those things that makes sci-fi a really hard genre, is simply the population size. You are dealing with a ton of people in a huge scope. Sci-fi is also a very trendy antagonist genre. That was not put very well, so let me explain what that means. The antagonist in sci-fi seems to always have a basis in whatever the trend is at the moment in our world. So at the moment that seems to very much be the evil AI, although that's been going on for a while. I mean, really, that's been going on since 2001. And for a while in, I guess, the early mid-2000s, it was VR, and in Metal Gear Solid 2, the VR training and all of that, and they kind of made their own cell phone on that later in the series, and Metal Gear Solid 4, but we don't talk about Metal Gear Solid 4, and I think that is also quite difficult with sci-fi. Like, a lot of writers want to relate it to our world by having that grounding point there, but a lot of it has been done so much that, again, it's just really difficult to sell it well. Like, all of these things together, I think these are some of the hardest elements to sell well in any fiction. But in a sort of sci-fi element and hell, you don't have to have a grounding point, and it can just be an entertaining story in space, and that's cool, that's great. But if you want to have that grounding point there, it's really, really hard. So, knowledge points with sci-fi, and, these are all the things I got wrong in my time and tried to correct with Alexis, and then that just never really went anywhere. Know thy lore. And I'll probably say this every episode. And it's something that, honestly, a lot of sci-fi seems to fall down on, is, the plasma gun, has X amount of ammo or whatnot. Yet somehow there's also they use Ex Machina, like, in every single situation. It means, oh wait, hang on, it can run on this, or it has this much ammo, and yeah, nothing's gonna turn, I would say, really anybody off faster than that. There's a lot of stuff like that in sci-fi because they will assume the reader doesn't know their science well enough to be able to critique it. And there will be an element of that, and maybe some things are actually grounded in legitimate science, but that's something you have to be careful with, and so knowing your lore is going to mitigate against that. Having things set in stone is going to be easier. It's a bit of the hard and soft magic thing, and I know a lot of people love soft magic systems, but I'm not one of those people. I'd like to actually understand what's going on, and I think in sci-fi in particular, because it's science, it's bound to be a harder basis. And keep on that thread, well, know thy science. Honestly, if you're going to be talking about scientific principles, you need to know what you're talking about, and this is one of the reasons I ditched sci-fi. Is because I just don't care. I'm not interested. I don't want to be doing tons and tons and tons of scientific research because I don't care. It's not interesting. And it's also, at the end of the day, the iPhone is magic to me. I don't know how it works. I don't care how it works. I don't need to know how it works. I can just accept it. So, and that's always a hard line to draw in sci-fi, is about where do you let things be magic and where don't you? And someone's always going to end up dissatisfied somewhere, but yeah, it's a difficult line, but you need to have a pretty good base level of knowledge that I don't have and I don't wish to have. The other thing I would say with sci-fi is know thy map. And this is one that really gets me in sci-fi, is travel times. Because, particularly in sci-fi, that really could do with being consistent. Because you can't necessarily just, I jump in a wormhole and I end up here, and isn't that serendipitous? Because, that just reads like bullshit. But, light speed is a set speed. And hyperspace is hyperspace at the end of the day. So if someone can't really just magically appear somewhere, and it's very easy to get wrong. I've done it myself a number of times. I'll go back again to, the last seasons of Game of Thrones where, people could just suddenly be in continents, in different continents, where in earlier seasons it would take multiple episodes for them to travel that distance. And bear in mind, I did not watch that show, but that was some bullshit, and nobody was happy about it. Getting something like the map and travel times wrong undermines the credibility of just about everything, and I think that's particularly hard in sci-fi, where a lot of things are a bit of a stretch anyway. And I have to say, with sci-fi, one of my biggest pet peeves, and this is the same in fantasy, is over-describing, because I don't need to know. As I said earlier, the iPhone's magic. I don't know how it works and I don't care. And the same goes for a lot of that as well. In sci-fi, a lot of the technology is basically magic. Unless it's directly plot relevant, I don't care. I really don't. And you're going to talk about how the engines are attached to, the fuel, and you're going to spend 6 pages on it. Well, mate, those six pages are going to be skipped. You should be able to keep the pacing through that. If you can't keep the pacing through that, you're gonna lose people. Apart from, the small subset of people who seem to really enjoy that, but it really does seem to be a small subset. Yes, I know it's a hot take. No, I don't care. And pacing, trying to do pacing with that is really hard. Don't get me wrong, it is hard. And trying to do pacing and travel is hard. Sci-fi, I think, is probably the single hardest genre to pace. It is. I think it is genuinely the hardest in this one. But it's also one of the genres that needs really good pacing, so that you can keep suspending your disbelief and keep accepting that this, effectively magic tech exists. And also not lose a high-stakes plot. High-stakes plots need to be pretty quick. Creatures in sci-fi are a bit of a debate about where the line between sci-fi and sci-fi fantasy blend is, and I mean, I do not know what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to get into that. And I think there is a place for creatures in sci-fi because, aliens. Aliens are a thing. And in something like Star Trek, it is done well. It's one of those things that is very Marmite, and it can very easily descend into, racism at the end of the day, or speciesism, or whatever. About, there's this whole race of evil creatures, and yeah, no, I'm not going to buy that every single one of these creatures in a population of even 100 is evil through and through. I'm not buying that. Let alone if you're talking about thousands or millions or an invading army, I'm not having it. And it does read as, and it is. Entire race is evil. That doesn't sound too great, does it? I think creatures are one of the hard things to pull off because, again, you need to have the basis in science here about how it biologically works and how it's adapted to different atmospheres, and then what that potentially means on other planets and other atmospheres. And again, it's just a whole big headache, a lot of it. And hell, some people really do enjoy figuring all of this out. That person ain't me. I'll put it right out there. So, things to watch for in sci-fi, I mean, there's almost always an element of the fuel. This is something that's really common. A lot of people hate it. I actually really like it. I think it's a good way of bringing a grounding point to things, but also creating pretty naturalistic and realistic tension as well, as opposed to resorting to a lot of shonky character work. I think there's not enough done with characters properly in sci-fi, and, the proper exploration of how isolating space travel can be, and okay, we're just away from all human contact for, months, if not years on end, and going stir crazy and all. I don't think that's explored enough in a lot of sci-fi. And you could make some really good character tension there, but people don't necessarily seem to do that in the best way. But also having something like fuel or ammunition, again, if you're writing the us versus the world story that is sort of fairly classic standard sci-fi, and especially if it's mass destruction and resource management and all that, you almost kind of need something like this. And you also need to know how it works. Is the fuel solid? Is it a liquid? How could you refine it? What's it made of? There's going to be a lot of science in this as well, and that's just kind of how it is. Another thing to keep an eye on, again, this pretty much goes without saying, it almost feels dumb to mention it, but the enemy. But more than that, it's the enemy's contacts and who they have the means to contact and get involved with. And again, a lot of this is knowing your lore and about how communications work. Can you just communicate with anyone, anywhere? That might read as bullshit, but I might let that go. And just where everybody is as well. This is very much know thy lore, know thy map. Where is everyone? What will they have figured out? Where are they moving to? It gets very complicated very quickly, and actually quite a similar way to something like crime. Because in something like crime, you have to keep track of, your main characters, all your detectives, all your criminals, where everybody is, what they're doing, and when. It actually is quite similar to that. And because I actually quite like to see more of a sci-fi crime blend in that capacity, I think that could be a really interesting project to explore. And because betrayal's such a big theme, it's pretty hard not to keep an eye on the allies in that capacity, but also in the same where is everybody? I mean, with sci-fi, there's a lot to keep track of in terms of where everyone is, what everyone's motivations are, what people have figured out and what they haven't, and the fuel on top of that, because it's pretty hard to write about travel without writing about resources. I mean, you can't, really. There's a lot of stuff to watch for, there's a lot of scientific knowledge, and there's going to be a lot of research because of that, because you'll need good knowledge of probably all three disciplines. I mean, especially if you talk about creatures, you're going to need some pretty good biological and physics-based knowledge of air pressures and things like that. And with all of the elements of travel and betrayal and all of these, trillions probably of people, mass destruction, and probably advanced technological antagonist, probably more advanced than protagonist, and maybe almost definitely doesn't exist in our world in the capacity it's in, how all that works. Trying to pace everything in a high stakes plot in particular, and trying to keep everything going. I really think sci-fi is probably the hardest genre. Just full stop. I think it is probably the single hardest genre to pull off. Because of all of these things combined. It's a lot of knowledge, a lot of world building, a lot of character work, preferably, and probably quite a lot of story. It's just a lot to pack in, and there's a reason that sci-fi books are pretty long. Because if you can do that in 70,000 words, I mean, you deserve a standing ovation, frankly. So this is not the first episode in the series, it's by no means going to be the last. If you've enjoyed this and you want to hear more of it, really the best way of making sure you don't miss an episode is to just subscribe, because there is no schedule for this podcast. There never has been, I'll be damned if there ever will be. So subscribing, and you can just scroll your subscriptions pane to see when I've uploaded. Hey, it's Wednesday, Jade's uploaded. Pretty easy, really. The other way to keep ahead is to check out Instagram. That is the home of the podcast. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. You'll get advance notice of what the weekly episode is. You'll also get soundbite teaser reels and other things as and when I experiment with them. So hit up Instagram, Jade_Black21 on there. If you want to know more about my writing, it's not going to be sci-fi. Not in a while, at least. But if you want to know more about my writing and my characters, that's Twitter, that's JadeBlack21. You'll get semi-live updates on there about what I'm doing, and I'm also a prompt host, so you might want to check those out. And all genres are welcome on those prompts. If you are a fellow writer and you are published or well on the way, particularly if you're indie and self-pub, please do get in touch. I'd love to be a part of your journey. I'd love to interview you. My email is jade42black@gmail.com. What I will need to know in that initial contact is in the description. There's a list. Please read that first. It's just better for everybody that way. It's easier. A few things to note. Doesn't have to be a particular genre. If you've got sci-fi and you want to talk about it, come on in. I would be really interested to know how you handle all of these things. Genuinely. I would love to hear that. It doesn't have to be a particular age category. It doesn't have to be a novel. Novellas are welcome. Overview of a trilogy. Whatever you've got, bring it in. Let's see what we can do. And until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me. Copyright JBlack 2024.